Welcome back, or if you're just joining us, welcome to the second hour of our journey through Trepanation's strange history. Get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and prepare to explore how this ancient practice survived into modern times in unexpected and disturbing ways. In the first hour, we traveled from Stone Age surgeons scraping through skulls with sharpened stones to medieval physicians with specialized instruments. We explored remarkable survival rates, the agony of conscious skull surgery, and how trepanation declined as modern medicine emerged. Now we'll discover that trepanation never truly ended. It evolved into modern neurosurgery while also persisting as a fringe practice among people who believe drilling holes in their skulls will expand their consciousness. Don't worry about following every detail. Let the words flow over you gently. If you drift away before our story ends, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin with how legitimate modern brain surgery borrowed from ancient trepanation while transforming it completely. Modern neurosurgery, trepanation's scientific heir. The craniotomy procedures performed by modern neurosurgeons are trepanation's direct descendants, borrowing the fundamental concept, opening the skull to access the brain, while transforming every aspect through scientific understanding and technological advancement. A contemporary neurosurgical craniotomy begins with advanced imaging. CT scans and MRIs map the brain structure in 3 dimensions, showing exactly where tumors, aneurysms, or injuries lie. Surgeons plan their approach carefully, choosing where and how large to make the skull opening based on precise knowledge of what they need to access. This is radically different from ancient trepanation, where surgeons worked blind, unable to see what lay beneath the bone until they opened it. The patient is completely unconscious under general anesthesia, feeling nothing, breathing managed by machines, vital signs monitored constantly. This is perhaps the most profound difference from ancient practice: no consciousness, no pain, no terrified awareness of bone being cut. The patient sleeps peacefully while their skull is opened, unaware of the procedure until they wake afterward. The surgical technique is refined and precise. The scalp is cut and carefully reflected back to expose bone. A high-speed surgical drill creates burr holes, small openings through the skull. A specialized saw called a craniotome cuts between these holes, creating a bone flap that can be lifted out in one piece. This flap will be replaced at the end of surgery, held with tiny plates and screws. Unlike ancient trepanation's permanent holes, modern craniotomies can be almost invisible once healed. Sterile technique prevents infection. Everything is sterilized: instruments, drapes, the surgical field itself. The operating room air is filtered. Antibiotics are administered. The elaborate precautions that modern surgery takes against infection would seem almost magical to ancient surgeons who watched helplessly as their patients developed fatal infections despite their best efforts. The brain work itself is delicate and targeted. Neurosurgeons use microscopes to see tiny structures, microinstruments to manipulate tissue without damage, sophisticated monitoring to ensure they don't harm critical areas. They can remove tumors, repair aneurysms, clip bleeding vessels, resect damaged tissue, interventions impossible with ancient techniques and understanding. Modern craniotomy survival rates are very high. For most routine procedures, survival exceeds 95%. Complications are relatively rare. Most patients recover fully and return to normal life. This stands in stark contrast to ancient trepanation's 50 to 80% survival rates and frequent complications. The difference reflects centuries of accumulated medical knowledge and technological development. Yet the fundamental act remains the same: opening a hole in the skull to access the brain. Modern neurosurgeons, working in high-tech operating rooms with teams of specialists and advanced equipment, are doing what Stone Age surgeons did with sharpened obsidian, creating an opening through bone to address problems within. The continuity is real even as the differences are profound. The gap between ancient and modern. Understanding what separates modern neurosurgery from ancient trepanation helps us appreciate both how far medicine has advanced and why some people remain fascinated by the older, more primitive approach. Knowledge is the primary difference. Modern neurosurgeons understand brain anatomy in exquisite detail. They know which brain regions control which functions, how blood flows through cerebral vessels, what happens when specific areas are damaged. Ancient trepanners had only the crudest understanding of what the brain did or how it worked. They operated based on empirical observation and trial and error rather than scientific knowledge. This knowledge allows modern surgery to be targeted and rational. When a neurosurgeon operates, they know what they're trying to accomplish and why their approach should work. They can predict outcomes, explain procedures to patients, make informed decisions about surgical approaches. Ancient surgeons worked with hope and tradition rather than understanding, unable to explain why trepanation sometimes helped beyond the most superficial observations. Technology creates another vast gulf. The imaging equipment, surgical instruments, monitoring devices, anesthesia machines, all of this represents capabilities ancient surgeons couldn't even imagine. The ability to see inside a living brain without opening it, to keep someone unconscious and pain-free for hours, to monitor oxygen levels and brain activity in real time, these technologies transform what's possible. Institutional support structures make modern neurosurgery safe and accessible in ways ancient surgery never was. Hospitals provide sterile environments, trained staff, emergency capabilities, postoperative care. Insurance systems and medical training programs ensure surgeons are qualified and patients have access. Ancient trepanation was individual practitioners working with minimal support, often in patients' homes or non-medical settings. Ethical frameworks govern modern surgery in ways that didn't exist for ancient practice. Informed consent requires surgeons to explain procedures, risks, and alternatives. Ethics committees oversee research and unusual procedures. Regulatory bodies ensure surgeons maintain standards. Ancient surgeons answered only to their own conscience and whatever social pressures existed in their communities. Yet despite these differences, some people have looked at modern neurosurgery and ancient trepanation and concluded that modern medicine has lost something important. They believe the ancient practice, stripped of its medical context and reimagined as consciousness expansion, offers benefits that modern surgery doesn't provide. These are the modern trepanation advocates, and their story is strange, disturbing, and deeply human. The modern trepanation movement emerges. In the 1960s, as Western culture was experimenting with altered consciousness through drugs, meditation, and various countercultural practices, a few individuals became convinced that trepanation, deliberately drilling a hole in one's own skull, could permanently expand awareness and improve mental function. The movement's intellectual father was Bart Huges, a Dutch librarian and medical school dropout who developed elaborate theories about trepanation and consciousness. Huges believed that standing upright had reduced blood flow to the human brain compared to our quadrupedal ancestors. This reduced blood flow, he argued, limited consciousness and mental capacity. Trepanation could reverse this by creating a permanent opening through which blood could flow more freely to the brain. Huges's theory had no scientific basis. It misunderstood blood flow, brain function, and evolution. Medical professionals who examined his ideas found them nonsensical. But Huges was convinced, and in 1965, he performed trepanation on himself using an electric drill, creating a small hole in his own skull. He claimed the procedure enhanced his consciousness, improved his mental function, and provided permanent benefits. He became an evangelist for self-trepanation, writing pamphlets and giving interviews about the procedure's supposed benefits. He recruited followers, people who found his theories compelling and were willing to consider drilling holes in their own skulls. The movement remained tiny. Most people who heard about it thought it was insane, but it attracted a small dedicated group of believers. One of these believers was Amanda Feilding, a British artist and countess who met Huges in the late 1960s. Feilding became convinced that trepanation would enhance her consciousness and creativity. In 1970, she performed trepanation on herself, filming the entire procedure. The film shows Feilding, conscious and lucid, using a dentist's drill to bore through her own skull. She narrates calmly as she works, blood running down her face, seemingly unconcerned by the horror of what she's doing. Feilding's self-trepanation film became notorious in underground and art circles. Some viewed it as brave exploration of consciousness and bodily autonomy. Others saw it as evidence of mental illness and dangerous delusion. Feilding herself claimed the procedure brought lasting benefits, enhanced energy, better sleep, improved mood. She remained convinced throughout her life that trepanation had positive effects, despite no scientific evidence supporting these claims. Other modern self-trepanation cases. Amanda Feilding was not the only person convinced by Bart Huges' theories to drill through their own skull. A small number of others attempted self-trepanation over the following decades, each with their own motivations and outcomes. Joe Mellon, Feilding's partner, became perhaps the most persistent self-trepanner. His first attempt in 1970 failed when the drill he was using wasn't powerful enough to penetrate his skull. His second attempt was interrupted when concerned friends stopped him mid-procedure. Finally, in his third attempt, he succeeded in creating a hole in his skull. Mellon wrote a book called Bore Hole, describing his experiences and his belief that trepanation had enhanced his life. Mellon's descriptions of the procedure are disturbing in their casual detail. He describes drilling through his skull while watching the process in a mirror, blood running down his face, the sound of the drill cutting through bone. He remained conscious throughout, as Huges and Feilding had, believing that consciousness during the procedure was important for achieving the desired effects. The matter-of-fact tone in which he describes this self-inflicted surgery is perhaps more unsettling than the act itself. Both Mellon and Feilding claimed lasting benefits from their trepanations. They reported feeling more energetic, more creative, more emotionally balanced. They described their consciousness as expanded, their minds as clearer. These subjective reports are impossible to verify or refute. Who can say whether someone feels more conscious or creative? But medical examinations found no objective improvements in cognitive function or mental health. Other cases were less well documented and less public. Occasional reports emerged of individuals who had attempted self-trepanation, some successfully creating skull openings, others failing or suffering complications. Most of these cases remained private, known only to the individuals involved and their immediate circles. The secrecy reflected awareness that mainstream society viewed self-trepanation as insane rather than enlightened. Some people traveled to countries where medical regulation was less strict, seeking practitioners who would perform trepanation. Mexico reportedly had a few surgeons willing to perform the procedure for foreigners, though verification of these claims is difficult. These medical trepanations for hire occupied a gray area, not illegal exactly, but certainly outside normal medical practice and ethics. The medical community's response to these cases was uniformly negative. Neurologists and psychiatrists who examined self-trepanners or reviewed their claims found no evidence that the procedure produced benefits. The holes in their skulls created unnecessary risk without providing any demonstrated advantage. The reported subjective improvements could be explained by placebo effect, confirmation bias, or simple delusion. Yet the believers remained convinced. No amount of medical skepticism or lack of scientific evidence deterred them. They had their own experiences, their own sense of improvement, their own conviction that trepanation had helped them. This disconnect between subjective experience and objective evidence is central to understanding the modern trepanation movement. Believers prioritized their own feelings and perceptions over scientific consensus. The third eye and consciousness theories. The modern trepanation movement's beliefs about consciousness and the brain were elaborate, pseudoscientific, and deeply appealing to certain countercultural communities exploring altered states and expanded awareness. Bart Huges's core theory, as mentioned earlier, focused on brain-blood volume. He believed that in infancy, before skull bones fused completely, the brain received more blood and consciousness was naturally expanded. As the skull hardened and sealed, blood volume decreased and consciousness contracted. Trepanation, by creating a permanent opening, would restore the skull's flexibility and increase brain blood volume, thereby expanding consciousness. This theory sounds plausible if you don't understand physiology. In reality, brain blood flow is tightly regulated regardless of skull openings. The body maintains constant cerebral blood flow through sophisticated mechanisms. A hole in the skull doesn't increase blood volume to the brain. Blood flow is determined by blood pressure, vessel diameter, and metabolic needs, not by whether there's an opening in the bone. Some trepanation advocates connected the practice to Eastern spiritual concepts, particularly the third eye, believed in Hindu and Buddhist traditions to be located in the forehead. They suggested that trepanation opened this third eye physically, enabling spiritual perception and enlightenment. This syncretism of ancient spiritual concepts with modern surgical intervention appealed to those seeking transcendent experiences through unconventional means. Others theorized that modern humans had lost something our ancestors possessed. They pointed to evidence of ancient trepanation and suggested that prehistoric peoples had understood consciousness in ways modern society had forgotten. Drilling holes in skulls was, in this view, recovering lost wisdom rather than practicing dangerous pseudo-medicine. This romanticization of the past ignored the medical reality that ancient trepanation was treating injuries and illness, not seeking consciousness expansion. The theories often incorporated ideas about brain hemispheres, cerebrospinal fluid, cranial pressure, and other physiological concepts, but always in ways that misunderstood or distorted actual biology. Believers would cite medical terminology to lend their theories credibility while fundamentally misunderstanding the processes they described. This veneer of scientific language made the theories seem more plausible to people without medical training. The subjective nature of consciousness made these theories difficult to definitively disprove. If someone claimed they felt more conscious after trepanation, how could anyone prove they didn't? Consciousness, awareness, creativity, these are difficult to measure objectively. The movement exploited this subjectivity, treating personal testimony as evidence equal to or superior to scientific study. Some advocates suggested that the medical establishment suppressed knowledge about trepanation's benefits, claiming that doctors dismissed the practice because it threatened pharmaceutical industry profits or medical authority. This conspiratorial thinking insulated believers from criticism. Any medical professional's skepticism could be dismissed as ulterior motives rather than legitimate scientific concern. The community that formed around trepanation, while never large, was mutually reinforcing. Believers shared their experiences, validated each other's perceptions, and developed shared language and concepts for discussing their beliefs. This created an echo chamber where doubts were dismissed and conviction strengthened, despite the lack of objective evidence. The art and counterculture connection. The modern trepanation movement found its most receptive audience not in medicine but in art and counterculture communities exploring consciousness, bodily autonomy, and transgressive practices. Amanda Feilding's self-trepanation film became an art object, screened in galleries and underground film venues. Viewers interpreted it variously, as performance art, as documentary, as political statement about bodily autonomy and medical authority. The film's graphic content and Feilding's calm narration created an unsettling juxtaposition that fascinated audiences even as it disturbed them. Feilding herself became a figure in London's artistic and intellectual counterculture. She associated with artists, writers, and thinkers exploring altered consciousness through various means: drugs, meditation, sensory deprivation, and yes, trepanation. In these circles, her trepanation was seen less as medical malpractice and more as radical self-experimentation, an extreme form of the consciousness exploration many in the counterculture pursued. The practice appealed to certain strains of 1960s and 70s counterculture that valued direct experience over authority, personal experimentation over institutional medicine, and transgression over conformity. If doctors said trepanation was dangerous and useless, that made it more appealing to people suspicious of medical establishment, not less. The procedure's very extremity became part of its attraction. It was ultimate commitment to consciousness exploration. Body modification communities showed some interest in trepanation as the most extreme form of modification possible. While most body modification focused on piercings, tattoos, scarification, or implants, trepanation represented the furthest possible boundary. A few individuals within body modification subcultures considered or attempted trepanation, though most modification practitioners and community members viewed it as too dangerous and medically unsound. Artists created works exploring trepanation themes. Paintings, sculptures, performances, and installations reference the practice, using it to explore concepts of consciousness, identity, medical authority, and the relationship between mind and body. These artworks helped keep trepanation in cultural consciousness even as the actual practice remained extraordinarily rare. Writers and philosophers occasionally discuss trepanation in works about consciousness, altered states, and the limits of experience. These treatments were usually more metaphorical than literal, trepanation as symbol for opening the mind, for breaking through barriers to perception, for radical transformation. But the symbolic discussions sometimes inspired literal interest in the physical practice. The persistence of belief. What's perhaps most striking about the modern trepanation movement is its persistence despite overwhelming evidence against it and the tiny number of actual practitioners. The belief survived across decades, passed between small numbers of adherents, maintaining themselves against all reason and medical consensus. Part of this persistence stems from the nature of subjective experience. If you undergo trepanation and afterward feel better, more conscious, more creative, even if these improvements are entirely placebo effect or confirmation bias, your personal experience feels real and convincing. No statistics about lack of objective benefit can override your own sense of improvement. The conspiracy theories insulated the movement from disproof. Any medical study showing no benefit could be dismissed as establishment bias. Any doctor warning about dangers could be characterized as protecting professional territory. This made the beliefs essentially unfalsifiable within the community. Every piece of contrary evidence was reinterpreted to support the existing worldview. The extreme nature of trepanation created strong commitment. Anyone who actually drilled a hole in their own skull had made such a dramatic gesture that admitting it was pointless or harmful would be psychologically difficult. The investment was too great. Better to maintain belief in benefits than to confront the possibility that you'd permanently damaged yourself for nothing. The occasional media coverage, while generally skeptical, kept the concept alive. Articles about modern trepanation believers, interviews with Feilding and Mellon, documentaries exploring the practice, all of this ensured that each generation had some exposure to the idea. A tiny fraction of those exposed became intrigued, and an even tinier fraction became believers willing to attempt the practice themselves. The Internet age brought trepanation advocates new platforms. Websites, forums, and social media allowed believers to connect across distances, share experiences, and recruit new followers. While the movement remained small, the Internet ensured it wouldn't disappear entirely, giving it presence and persistence it might not have maintained in a purely analog world. Medical opposition and warnings. The medical establishment's response to modern trepanation advocacy has been consistently and emphatically negative. Doctors and neurosurgeons who have examined the practice and its proponents have found no legitimate medical or scientific basis for voluntary trepanation. Neurologists point out that the theories underlying modern trepanation beliefs are anatomically and physiologically nonsensical. Brain blood flow is not determined by skull openings. Creating a hole in the skull does not increase blood volume to the brain. The claims about expanded consciousness have no basis in neuroscience. Everything believers claim about how trepanation works contradicts established understanding of brain function. The risks are real and significant. Any breach of the skull creates infection risk, even with sterile technique in hospital settings. Self-trepanation in non-medical environments with unsterilized tools creates enormous danger of life-threatening brain infections. Meningitis, brain abscess, and sepsis can all result from introducing bacteria through skull openings. Without immediate access to antibiotics and intensive care, these infections are often fatal. Bleeding is another major risk. The scalp is highly vascular and bleeds profusely when cut. The skull bone itself contains blood vessels that can bleed during drilling. Most dangerously, penetrating too deeply can damage blood vessels on the brain's surface, causing hemorrhage that can be rapidly fatal. Self-trepanners working without medical monitoring might not recognize dangerous bleeding until it's too late. Brain damage from accidental penetration too deeply is a constant risk. The line between opening the skull to the dura mater and accidentally puncturing that membrane and damaging brain tissue is thin. Even trained neurosurgeons working with specialized equipment and imaging occasionally cause unintended injuries. Someone drilling their own skull with a hand drill is at enormous risk of penetrating too far and destroying brain tissue. Seizures can result from brain irritation caused by the procedure. The trauma of drilling, exposure of brain membranes, and inflammation from the procedure can trigger seizure disorders that may persist long-term. Someone who underwent trepanation believing it would help them might end up with a new serious medical condition they didn't have before. The psychological evaluation of people who desire trepanation is concerning to mental health professionals. The desire to drill through one's own skull, the elaborate rationalizations and pseudoscientific theories, the persistence despite all medical warnings, these suggest possible mental health issues. Some psychiatrists who have evaluated trepanation advocates have diagnosed body dysmorphic disorder, delusional disorder, or other psychiatric conditions. Medical ethics firmly oppose any doctor performing trepanation for consciousness expansion or any non-medical reason. The principle of, first, do no harm makes it unethical to perform surgery that carries significant risks without medical benefit. Any physician who performed trepanation for a patient seeking consciousness expansion would face license revocation and possible criminal charges for medical malpractice or assault. Professional medical organizations have issued statements against non-medical trepanation. Neurosurgical societies, medical boards, and public health authorities have all warned about the dangers and condemned the practice. While these statements haven't deterred true believers, they've prevented the movement from gaining any medical legitimacy or recruiting practitioners willing to perform the procedures. Cases of harm and death. While the modern trepanation movement has been small, it has not been without casualties. Some attempts at self-trepanation have resulted in serious injury or death, though exact numbers are difficult to establish due to the secretive nature of the practice. Not all self-trepanation attempts are successful even at creating an opening. Some people begin the procedure but cannot complete it, the pain is too great, blood loss is too severe, or the practical difficulties prove insurmountable. These failed attempts can still cause injury, scalp wounds requiring stitches, bone damage, psychological trauma. Some people who attempted trepanation and failed required emergency medical treatment, presenting at hospitals with partially drilled skulls and bleeding scalp wounds. Some successful trepanations led to infections. Despite the procedures being performed in non-sterile conditions with inadequate tools, many self-trepanners survived the immediate procedure. But days or weeks later, some developed infections, localized skull infections, or worse, meningitis or brain abscesses. These infections required hospitalization and aggressive antibiotic treatment. In eras before modern antibiotics, such infections would have been almost uniformly fatal. There are unconfirmed reports of deaths resulting from self-trepanation attempts, though documentation is sparse. The very secretive nature of the practice means that when someone dies from a botched self-trepanation, it might not be publicly reported or might be recorded as suicide rather than accidental death. Families of people who died attempting trepanation would likely have strong incentives to keep the circumstances private, both from grief and from embarrassment. One documented near-death occurred when a woman attempting self-trepanation penetrated too deeply and caused significant bleeding. She was found unconscious by family members and rushed to a hospital, where emergency neurosurgery was required to control the bleeding and repair the damage. She survived but was left with permanent neurological deficits from the brain injury. The hospital reported the case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the practice. Some people who underwent trepanation and initially claimed benefits later experienced problems. Chronic headaches at the trepanation site, persistent infections requiring multiple surgeries, seizure disorders developing after the procedure. These delayed complications revealed that even successful trepanations could cause lasting harm. Some people who enthusiastically promoted trepanation in the immediate aftermath later regretted the decision as complications emerged. The psychological aftermath for some was also negative. Realizing they had permanently damaged themselves based on pseudoscientific theories, facing social stigma and family disappointment, dealing with medical complications, these consequences took psychological tolls. Some people who underwent trepanation experienced depression, regret, and shame about what they had done to themselves. Medical professionals who have treated self-trepanation injuries report frustration and sadness. They're required to repair damage that was entirely preventable and self-inflicted, using medical resources to address consequences of belief in pseudoscience. The injuries are serious, the repairs are complex, and the knowledge that it all could have been avoided makes the cases particularly difficult for healthcare workers. Ethical and legal questions. The modern trepanation movement raises difficult ethical and legal questions about bodily autonomy, mental capacity, and the limits of self-determination. The principle of bodily autonomy suggests that mentally competent adults should be able to make their own decisions about their bodies, even decisions that others consider unwise. People are generally allowed to get tattoos, undergo cosmetic surgery, or engage in risky activities. If someone truly believes trepanation will benefit them and understands the risks, shouldn't they be allowed to proceed? But this argument has limits. Society doesn't allow people to seriously harm themselves based on delusional beliefs. If someone wants to amputate a healthy limb because they believe it doesn't belong to their body, most jurisdictions don't permit this and doctors won't perform the surgery. Trepanation based on pseudoscientific beliefs about consciousness expansion might fall into this category, serious self-harm based on false beliefs rather than legitimate exercise of autonomy. The question of mental competency is central. Are people who want to drill holes in their own skulls mentally competent to make that decision? The very desire might be evidence of impaired judgment or mental illness. Yet many self-trepaners are articulate, intelligent, and functional in other areas of their lives. They're not globally incompetent, just convinced of one particular false belief. Where is the line between legitimate autonomy and dangerous delusion? Legal systems generally don't criminalize self-trepanation. There are no laws specifically forbidding drilling a hole in your own skull. However, if someone dies attempting it, there might be legal consequences for anyone who assisted or encouraged them. If someone convinced another person to undergo trepanation and provided tools or instructions, they might face charges related to causing harm or death. Doctors who perform trepanation for non-medical reasons face clear legal jeopardy. Performing surgery without medical indication violates medical ethics and licensing standards. Even if the patient consented, even if they insisted they wanted the procedure, a doctor who complied would likely lose their medical license and face criminal charges for assault or practicing medicine in a harmful manner. The Internet's role in facilitating trepanation interest creates new ethical questions. Should websites that promote trepanation be allowed to exist? Do they constitute incitement to self-harm? Or are they protected speech, no different from websites about other controversial practices? Most jurisdictions have allowed such content under free speech protections, though platforms might choose to remove it under their own policies. Family members of people considering trepanation face agonizing choices. Do you try to stop an adult family member from doing something dangerous and foolish? Can you have them committed for psychiatric evaluation? Do you risk your relationship by opposing them or support autonomy while watching them harm themselves? These are impossible situations with no good answers. The question of belief and evidence. At its core, the modern trepanation movement illustrates a fundamental conflict about how we know what's true and what role personal experience should play in evaluating medical claims. The believers prioritized subjective experience. They underwent trepanation and felt better afterward. This direct personal experience feels more real and convincing to them than any number of scientific studies or medical opinions. From their perspective, doctors who haven't tried trepanation are unqualified to judge it. Only personal experience can validate or invalidate the practice. This approach sounds reasonable until you consider how unreliable subjective experience can be. Placebo effects are powerful. People feel better from treatments that do nothing simply because they believe in them. Confirmation bias leads people to notice improvements and ignore deteriorations. The investment fallacy makes people unwilling to admit that something they sacrificed for was worthless. All of these psychological factors mean personal experience alone is insufficient evidence. The scientific method was developed precisely because personal experience is unreliable. Controlled studies, double-blind protocols, statistical analysis, these tools help separate actual effects from illusion, bias, and chance. Medicine relies on this approach because it produces more reliable knowledge than personal testimony. The fact that someone feels better after a treatment doesn't prove the treatment caused the improvement. Yet there's also something understandable about the believer's position. Modern medicine doesn't have all the answers. Doctors are sometimes wrong. Conventional treatments fail. People in desperate circumstances might understandably seek alternatives, even extreme ones. The desire to take control of one's own health and consciousness, to try something unconventional when conventional approaches haven't worked, these are human responses to suffering and limitation. The tragedy is when this understandable impulse leads to self-harm based on false beliefs. Trepanation doesn't expand consciousness. It doesn't increase brain blood flow. It doesn't cure mental illness or enhance creativity. It just creates unnecessary risks and potential damage. The believer's sincerity and desperation don't make the practice effective or safe, they just make the situation sadder. Traditional practices that continue. While trepanation has disappeared from Western medicine and persists only as fringe pseudoscience among a few believers, in some parts of the world traditional forms of the practice have continued into modern times, though they are rapidly vanishing as modern medicine reaches previously isolated communities. In remote areas of Kenya, traditional healers among certain ethnic groups continued performing trepanation into the late 20th century, primarily as treatment for head injuries. These healers used techniques passed down through generations, working with basic metal tools to create skull openings for patients with depressed fractures or persistent headaches following trauma. The practice was purely medical in their cultural context, not spiritual or consciousness expanding, but practical treatment for conditions that caused suffering. Anthropologists who documented these practices in the 1970s and 1980s found that the traditional healers had sophisticated understanding of skull anatomy relative to their available knowledge. They knew where they could safely drill and where they must avoid. They understood postoperative care, keeping wounds clean, monitoring for fever, recognizing signs of complications. Their empirical knowledge, developed over generations, allowed survival rates that, while not matching modern neurosurgery, were better than no treatment at all. The healers themselves understood they were treating last resort cases. They didn't perform trepanation casually or frequently. It was dangerous, they knew, reserved for situations where the alternative was death or severe disability. A patient with a depressed skull fracture causing seizures, or bone fragments pressing inward from a head injury, might be trepanned when no other treatment offered hope. The decision to proceed involved consultation with family, assessment of the patient's condition, and careful consideration of risks versus potential benefits. Similar practices have been documented in remote areas of Papua New Guinea, parts of Bolivia, and scattered locations in Africa and Asia. In each case, the context was traditional healing rather than modern medicine or fringe consciousness expansion. The practitioners were respected community members with specialized knowledge, not outsiders promoting controversial theories. The patients were people suffering from injuries or illnesses, not healthy individuals seeking enhanced awareness. These traditional practices differ fundamentally from modern trepanation advocacy. The traditional healers made no claims about consciousness expansion or increased brain blood flow. They were treating observable problems, skull fractures, ongoing pain, disability from head trauma. Their understanding of why the procedure sometimes helped might have been incomplete or incorrect, but their intentions were therapeutic and their indications for surgery were based on real medical need. As modern medical facilities have reached previously isolated communities, traditional trepanation has rapidly disappeared. Why would a traditional healer perform risky skull surgery when a hospital with proper neurosurgical capabilities is now accessible? Why would families choose traditional trepanation when modern CT scans can show exactly what's wrong and modern surgery can address it safely? The answer is they largely wouldn't, and don't. Traditional trepanation is vanishing as access to modern medicine expands. Some anthropologists and medical historians have worked to document these traditional practices before they completely disappear. They've interviewed healers, recorded techniques, and preserved knowledge that represents centuries of empirical medical learning. This documentation serves historical and anthropological purposes, creating records of how different cultures developed surgical capabilities and medical knowledge systems. It's preservation of cultural heritage, not promotion of the practices themselves. Anthropological perspectives. Anthropologists who have studied trepanation across cultures and time periods offer valuable perspectives on what the practice reveals about human societies, healing, and responses to suffering. Trepanation represents one of the oldest surgical procedures that humans developed. That it emerged independently in cultures around the world, Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands, suggests that when humans develop certain levels of tool sophistication and face certain medical problems, trepanation becomes a logical possibility. The convergent evolution of the practice across isolated populations is itself anthropologically significant. The survival of trepanned individuals in ancient populations, evidenced by healed bone around skull openings, demonstrates sophisticated surgical knowledge in prehistoric societies. This challenges assumptions about ancient peoples being primitive or incapable of complex interventions. They may not have understood brain function as we do, but they understood enough anatomy and developed sufficient surgical skill to open skulls and keep patients alive. This demands respect for ancient medical knowledge even when it was incomplete or incorrect. The role of the trepanner in various societies reveals how medical specialists developed and how healing knowledge was transmitted. In some cultures, trepanation was performed by shamans or spiritual healers, linking medical and spiritual roles. In others, it was done by specialists whose role was purely medical. In still others, it might be a skill held by elders or family members, part of general healing knowledge rather than specialized expertise. These different social organizations of medical knowledge reflect broader cultural patterns. The persistence of trepanation across millennia indicates it must have provided some benefit, even if that benefit wasn't what practitioners believed. A practice that never helped anyone, that only caused death and suffering, would not have been maintained for thousands of years across diverse cultures. Either trepanation sometimes actually addressed the conditions it was intended for, or it provided powerful placebo effects, or the process of bone healing was mistaken for cure of the original condition. Something sustained the practice despite its risks. Anthropologists note that trepanation practices were embedded in broader belief systems about health, illness, body, and spirit. Understanding trepanation requires understanding these wider contexts. What did a culture believe caused headaches or seizures? How did they understand the relationship between body and consciousness? What other healing practices existed alongside trepanation? The procedure never existed in isolation but as part of comprehensive medical systems. The decline of traditional trepanation in the modern era represents broader patterns of medical globalization and the displacement of traditional healing by biomedicine. This process has complex effects. Lives are saved by modern medicine's effectiveness, but traditional knowledge is lost, and communities' medical autonomy decreases as they become dependent on external medical systems. The disappearance of traditional trepanation is one small example of these larger transformations. Some anthropologists argue for medical pluralism, where traditional and modern medical systems coexist and patients choose between them based on their beliefs and circumstances. However, even advocates of medical pluralism don't typically include trepanation among practices worth preserving. The risks are too high and modern alternatives too effective. Traditional trepanation is documented for historical and cultural understanding rather than as viable contemporary practice. What trepanation reveals about medicine? Examining trepanation's long history, from ancient practice through modern neurosurgery to contemporary fringe movements, reveals fundamental truths about medicine, healing, and human responses to suffering. Trepanation demonstrates that people will try extreme measures when suffering is great enough. Cutting through your own skull seems insane until you're desperate, suffering unbearable pain, experiencing terrifying seizures, facing death from injury. Then the insane becomes thinkable, even logical. The practice persisted because people suffered and were willing to try almost anything for relief. This desperation continues today, explaining why some turn to unproven treatments or extreme interventions when conventional medicine fails them. The history shows how medical practices can persist based on partial success and misunderstood mechanisms. Ancient trepaners didn't understand why the procedure sometimes helped, but they observed that it did sometimes help, and this was enough. They developed elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain the benefits, releasing evil spirits, balancing humors, whatever their culture's medical paradigm suggested. Being wrong about mechanisms didn't prevent them from occasionally achieving positive results. Trepanation illustrates how intention and outcome can diverge dramatically in medicine. Ancient surgeons intended to help and sometimes succeeded. Modern trepanation advocates intend to expand consciousness but achieve only risk and potential harm. Medieval physicians intended to cure when they trepanned for epilepsy or mental illness, but likely caused more harm than good. Good intentions are necessary but insufficient for good medicine. Understanding actual mechanisms and effects matters more than sincere desire to help. The practice reveals the importance of empirical testing and scientific method. Personal experience and anecdotal evidence suggested trepanation helped, but controlled study would have shown that in many cases, patients recovered despite trepanation rather than because of it, or that the procedure addressed some conditions while being useless or harmful for others. Modern medicine's insistence on rigorous testing before accepting treatments exists because empirical observation alone produces unreliable knowledge. Trepanation's evolution demonstrates how medical knowledge accumulates. Each generation of practitioners built on previous knowledge, refined techniques, improved outcomes. Incan surgeons achieving 80% survival rates represented centuries of accumulated learning. Modern neurosurgery inherited this accumulated knowledge while transforming it through scientific understanding. Progress happens through building on what came before, even when correcting errors and misconceptions of earlier practitioners. The modern trepanation movement shows how medical knowledge can regress when severed from scientific method and institutional medicine. Bart Huges and his followers essentially reinvented trepanation badly, stripping away the medical indications that had guided traditional practice while adding pseudoscientific theories. Their version was worse than ancient practice because they had lost the empirical restraint that kept traditional trepanners focused on observable conditions rather than unfalsifiable claims about consciousness. Trepanation and human resilience. Perhaps most striking about trepanation's history is what it reveals about human resilience, both the resilience of patients who survived having their skulls opened without anesthesia, and the resilience of healers who persisted in developing medical knowledge despite enormous obstacles. The patients who endured ancient trepanation and survived showed extraordinary physical and psychological resilience. They lay still for hours while their skulls were scraped open. They survived the trauma, blood loss, and pain. Their bodies healed despite primitive conditions and high infection risk. Some underwent multiple trepanations, surviving the procedure again and again. This resilience speaks to the human body's remarkable capacity to withstand and recover from injury. The surgeons who performed trepanation across centuries demonstrated intellectual and emotional resilience. They faced failures, patients who died despite their efforts. They worked without understanding why procedures sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed. They persisted in developing knowledge despite limited tools and theoretical frameworks. Their commitment to healing, even when healing was uncertain and methods were crude, sustained medical practice across generations. Families who supported patients through trepanation showed their own resilience. They made desperate decisions about whether to allow surgery. They provided care during recovery. They lived with outcomes, sometimes grateful for survivors, sometimes grieving deaths, often coping with partially recovered patients who needed ongoing support. Their resilience sustained communities through recurring crises of injury and illness. The very persistence of medical practice across human history, despite its frequent failures and limitations, demonstrates collective resilience. Humans didn't abandon medicine when it failed, didn't give up on healing when patients died. Instead, they refined techniques, developed new approaches, accumulated knowledge slowly and painfully. This persistence eventually produced effective medicine, but only through generations of healers and patients showing remarkable resilience in the face of suffering and uncertainty. Desperation and hope. As we approach the end of our journey through trepanation's strange history, let's reflect on the powerful emotions that have driven this practice across millennia, desperation and hope intertwined, pushing people to extreme measures. Desperation explains much about trepanation. The desperate parent watching a child suffer seizures. The desperate warrior with a depressed skull fracture causing unbearable pain. The desperate person with chronic headaches that never cease. When suffering reaches certain levels, when death seems imminent or ongoing pain unbearable, people become willing to try almost anything. Trepanation emerged from this desperation, from situations where any hope seemed better than resignation. But hope was equally important. Without hope that the procedure might help, desperation alone wouldn't have been enough. Ancient peoples observed that some trepanned patients improved. This created hope. Maybe this suffering could be relieved, maybe this person could be saved, maybe drilling through the skull would help. This hope, however slender and based on incomplete understanding, sustained the practice across generations. The modern trepanation advocates show these same dynamics, though in distorted form. They're desperate too, desperate for enhanced consciousness, desperate for relief from depression or anxiety, desperate to feel different than they do. And they have hope, however misplaced, that trepanation will provide what they seek. Their desperation and hope are real emotions, even if directed toward a practice that cannot deliver what they imagine. This combination of desperation and hope drives much human behavior, medical and otherwise. We try unproven treatments because we're desperate and hope they might work. We undergo risky procedures because we're desperate for the possible benefits and hope we'll be among the fortunate survivors. Understanding this pattern helps us comprehend why people make choices that seem irrational or dangerous from outside perspectives. The challenge is distinguishing between reasonable hope based on evidence and false hope based on desperation alone. Ancient trepaners had evidence, some patients did survive and improve. Modern neurosurgeons have evidence, controlled studies show their procedures work. Modern trepanation advocates have desperation and hope but no legitimate evidence. Learning to evaluate evidence rather than being swayed purely by emotional need is crucial for medical decision-making. Yet we should feel compassion for those whose desperation and hope lead them astray. The person who undergoes self-trepanation seeking consciousness expansion is misguided, but their underlying desire for transformation, for relief from suffering, for enhanced experience, these are human and understandable. The tragedy is when desperation and hope drive actions that harm rather than help, when the very attempts to improve one's situation create new problems. Healthcare systems should address the desperation that makes extreme measures appealing. When people seek trepanation or other harmful unproven treatments, it often reflects failures of conventional medicine to adequately address their suffering. Better pain management, better mental health treatment, more compassionate care, these might reduce the desperation that drives people toward dangerous alternatives. The boundary between medicine and belief. Trepanation's history illuminates the boundary between medicine and belief, between practices based on evidence and effectiveness versus those sustained by faith, tradition, or wishful thinking. Ancient trepanation occupied a space between these categories. It was based partly on observation. Practitioners saw that some patients improved, but also on belief systems about humors, spirits, or other concepts we now know were incorrect. The practice combined empirical knowledge about how to open skulls safely with theoretical frameworks that were fundamentally wrong about why this helped. This mixture of practical knowledge and false belief characterizes much of medical history. Medieval medicine similarly blended observation and theory in ways that modern science recognizes as problematic. Physicians correctly observed that trepanation sometimes helped head trauma patients, but their explanations involving humoral imbalances were incorrect. They developed real surgical skill while operating within a flawed theoretical framework. The skill was valuable even when the theory was not. The transition to scientific medicine involved separating what actually worked from what people believed worked. This required systematic testing, controlled studies, and willingness to abandon cherished theories when evidence contradicted them. It meant privileging empirical results over theoretical elegance or traditional authority. This was difficult. It required admitting that much of what had been believed and practiced was wrong or ineffective. Modern trepanation advocacy represents a regression, a return to privileging belief over evidence. The advocates have elaborate theories about consciousness and blood flow, but no evidence that their theories are correct or that trepanation produces the benefits they claim. They've created a belief system that feels coherent to them but doesn't align with reality. This shows how easy it is to slip back into belief-based rather than evidence-based thinking. The boundary between medicine and belief isn't always clear. Some conventional medical practices have weaker evidence bases than ideal. Some alternative approaches have elements of value alongside unproven claims. Patients' beliefs and expectations affect treatment outcomes through placebo effects, making the relationship between belief and healing complex. Complete separation of belief from medicine may be impossible because humans are not purely rational beings. But the direction matters. Medicine should move toward better evidence, more rigorous testing, clearer understanding of mechanisms and effects. When practices move away from evidence toward pure belief, when claims become unfalsifiable and immune to testing, we've crossed into territory that's no longer medicine in any meaningful sense. Modern trepanation advocacy has crossed this boundary, becoming belief system rather than medical practice. Respecting the boundary between medicine and belief protects people. When we insist that medical claims be tested and proven, we reduce harm from ineffective or dangerous treatments. When we privilege evidence over tradition or authority, we create space for progress and improvement. When we maintain appropriate skepticism toward dramatic claims unsupported by data, we protect vulnerable people from exploitation. These boundaries exist for good reasons. What modern medicine has learned. The complete arc of trepanation's history, from ancient practice through modern neurosurgery to contemporary fringe movements, has contributed to contemporary medical ethics, practice standards, and understanding of what makes good medicine. Modern medical ethics emphasizes informed consent in ways that ancient medicine did not. Patients must understand what procedures involve, what risks exist, what alternatives are available. They must consent freely, without coercion. While ancient trepaners likely explained what they would do, the modern standards are much more rigorous. This evolution reflects recognition that medical interventions are serious and patients deserve full understanding before proceeding. The principle of evidence-based practice emerged partly from observing how medical procedures persisted based on tradition, authority, or theory rather than proven effectiveness. Trepanation for epilepsy or mental illness continued for centuries despite lack of evidence it helped these conditions. Modern medicine's insistence on demonstrating that treatments actually work before widely deploying them aims to prevent similar persistence of ineffective practices. The recognition that good intentions are insufficient for good medicine comes from examining practices like trepanation. Ancient surgeons meant well, worked hard, and cared about patients, yet often harmed as much as helped because their understanding was incomplete. Modern medicine recognizes that effectiveness must be demonstrated, not merely assumed based on sincere desire to help or elaborate theoretical frameworks. The development of surgical specialization reflects lessons from procedures like trepanation. Opening skulls safely requires specific knowledge, training, and skill. Having dedicated neurosurgeons with extensive training produces better outcomes than general practitioners attempting brain surgery occasionally. This specialization principle extends throughout modern medicine, with recognition that complex procedures require focused expertise. The importance of sterile technique and infection control came through painful experience with procedures like trepanation that frequently caused fatal infections. The development of antiseptic and later aseptic surgical practices revolutionized outcomes. Modern surgery's elaborate sterility protocols exist because the alternative, the horrific infection rates of earlier eras, is unacceptable. The modern understanding that patients deserve effective pain control during procedures represents enormous progress from the era when trepanation was performed on fully conscious patients. Anesthesia transformed surgery from terrifying ordeal to manageable medical intervention. Modern pain management continues to advance, reflecting commitment to reducing suffering that ancient surgeons couldn't achieve. The institutional structures supporting modern medicine, hospitals, medical schools, licensing boards, ethics committees, developed partly in response to problems exemplified by historical practices like trepanation. These institutions aim to ensure competent practitioners, maintain standards, protect patients, and prevent harmful practices from persisting. They're imperfect, but they represent attempts to systematize quality control in ways that didn't exist historically. The continuing legacy. Trepanation's legacy continues in multiple ways, from the neurosurgical procedures that are its legitimate descendants to the cautionary tale it provides about medical hubris and the dangers of belief unsupported by evidence. Every modern craniotomy owes something to the ancient surgeons who first discovered that skulls could be opened and patients could survive. The fundamental insight that the brain is accessible to surgical intervention, that opening the skull is possible and sometimes beneficial. This came from millennia of trepanation practice. Modern neurosurgery has transformed the technique beyond recognition, but the basic concept traces back to Stone Age surgeons with sharpened stones. The skulls in museums and archaeological collections serve as tangible reminders of this history. Each healed opening testifies to a patient who survived, a surgeon who succeeded, a family that hoped and sometimes saw that hope fulfilled. These bones connect us to ancestors who faced suffering with courage and developed medical knowledge despite enormous obstacles. They deserve respect and remembrance. The modern trepanation advocates, however misguided, remind us that the impulse to self-experiment, to try extreme measures, to believe in transformative interventions persists. As long as people suffer, as long as consciousness seems limited or problematic, some will seek extreme solutions. The specific form changes: trepanation, lobotomy, various drugs, technological interventions, but the underlying pattern continues. The story of trepanation teaches humility. Ancient peoples accomplished extraordinary things with limited tools and knowledge. Modern medicine knows much more, but gaps and uncertainties remain. Future generations will look back at some of our current practices with the same mixture of respect and horror we feel toward trepanation. We're not at the end of medical progress, and our current understanding isn't complete or final. As you drift toward the end of this journey, perhaps you'll think about the long arc of human attempts to heal, to understand the brain, to address suffering. From Stone Age surgeons to modern neurosurgeons to misguided consciousness seekers, all have sought to improve the human condition, with varying levels of success and understanding. Good night.